Welcome to Daily Dose of Aramaic Grammar Lessons. This is Lesson 14, in which we're going to be talking about weak verbs. More information on this topic can be found in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 116 to 117. I'd just like to pause for a moment to insert a note here before we start studying this topic for Biblical Aramaic, and that is to bring up the issue that in Biblical Hebrew instruction, weak verbs is one of the more difficult topics. To bring this up conjures up mental images of poring through extensive paradigm charts to track down the influence of weak radicals, one or more of them, upon the spelling of weak verbs. We're not going to do that. There are other treatments of weak verbs that bury information about the influence of weak radicals upon the spelling of verbs in dense paragraphs. We're not going to take that approach either. What are we going to do? We're going to look at a comprehensive chart that places all information about Biblical Aramaic weak verbs that we need in one place, on one page. And to find the Biblical Hebrew equivalent, which I've seen nowhere else, you need to look at Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, because this is the Aramaic page. Let's start off with the first position. That is to say, the first position has a weak radical. So one guttural. In this case, this is if there's an ayin, a hey, or a chet in the first position, because one aleph is a separate kind of weak verb class. So that one guttural is going to take a compound shavah instead of a vocal shavah. And here's an example. This is the verbal root ayin, beit, dalet. And in this case, this is the pa'alg, perfect third masculine plural. When that third masculine plural shurik vav suffix is being added, there's a vowel reduction under the first consonant. Now, in a strong verb, this would reduce that vowel to a vocal shavah, but that can't happen in this case. So that first position guttural will take the hatef patach, the compound shavah, instead of the vocal shavah. So this is expected from our biblical Hebrew learning, so now we can move on to one aleph. In prefixed forms, which includes imperfect, but there are also other cases, other kinds of prefixes, the one aleph may quiesce or drop. So quiescing has to do with the aleph being there in the form, but having lost its consonantal value. And then dropping may not be expected, as in this case. So this is a hafel c imperfect third masculine plural. The yod at the front, that's an imperfect prefix. The hey that follows it, that's the hafel prefix. And then we get beit dalet, and then we hit shurik vav nun, which has to do with the imperfect third masculine plural form. So all we have for a root in this form is beit dalet. That's because the aleph has dropped out. And we may not have expected that from our biblical Hebrew intuition. Next, for one nun verbs, in prefixed forms, the nun usually assimilates. So here we have nun pei lamed, that verbal root, and the nun has assimilated and now exists as a dagesh there in that pei. This is the pa'alg imperfect third masculine singular of that verbal root. This has happened frequently in our biblical Hebrew studies, so does not come as a surprise. But then we arrive at the one vav and one yod class. Now, why do I have one vav in parentheses? That's because from a historical standpoint, there was a time when there were verbal roots that had a vav at the beginning, but in biblical Aramaic, they've all become where there's a yod in the first position. There's a similar dynamic going on in Hebrew, but under certain circumstances, that original vav returns. So let's see that. Here's the yod dalet ayin verbal root, where in this hafel c perfect third masculine singular form, that vav has returned. It's not a yod there in the first position. But what we definitely don't expect is this. This is also yod dalet ayin. But in this pa'alg imperfect third masculine plural form, instead of there being a yod remaining, deleting, or becoming a vav, there's a nun there. We would not have expected that at all from our Hebrew studies. This has to do with a dynamic in biblical Aramaic called nasalization. So nasalization generates the placement of a nun in certain circumstances, and this is one of those. So let's shift now to looking at the middle consonant. starting with to guttural. And we know that gutturals reject doubling. And so in the case where we have D stems, one of the characteristic things we see with D stems is the doubling of that middle radical. So gutturals and resh cannot take a dagesh. So we should expect with a to resh root compensatory lengthening, and that's what we see here with beit resh kaf in the pa'el, D perfect third masculine singular form, where the expected vowel under the beit would be a patach. But when the pa'el D form was attempting to place a dagesh, if you want to think of it this way, in the resh, that triggered compensatory lengthening. So the short A vowel patach lengthens to a long A vowel kametz in this case. And the other case is the to hey, to chet, to ayin. Why didn't I include aleph? Because the two aleph roots don't appear in D stems in biblical Aramaic. So in those cases listed there, there's virtual doubling, meaning that dagesh of the doubling sort of gets absorbed by those gutturals and does not trigger compensatory lengthening. Okay, let's go over to the hollow verbs. Hollow verbs have a yod or a vav in middle position. And very similar to biblical Hebrew, we have this example. It's sin, yod, mem. This is the pa'al G perfect third masculine singular. The yod has deleted. So this is according to our expectations we've developed from Hebrew, but what is not in accord to expectations is this. For the kof, vav, mem root, the pa'al G participle masculine singular has an aleph in the middle. So this is strange. For hollow verbs, the middle radical can become an aleph in the G participle. And then finally, a special note, resh, vav, mem manifests in the polel and hit polel stems because of it being a hollow root. So this is just something special. Those stems are associated with this root in biblical Aramaic and vice versa. And then finally, looking at the Geminates, remember what a Geminate is? It's position 2 and position 3 root consonants are the same. So look at this. This is dalet, kof, kof. And as an aside, in biblical Aramaic, the attested Geminates are where there are dalet, dalet in position 2 and 3, lamed, lamed, mem, mem, kof, kof. So this is one of those kof, kof verbs. Okay, so that dagesh, is that a dagesh lene? Because that's a begad kafat letter. What the reference grammars say here is that instead of there being a doubled kof here, the doubling has shifted to the first consonant. That's not going to make a big difference in interpretation. I don't see that tripping up anybody as long as we recognize that this is dalet, kof, kof, and then that kametz hey on the end is the feminine singular participle ending. But look at this. This is ayin, lamed, lamed, hafel C perfect third masculine singular. How do you explain that noon? Well, here you have that nasalization going on again, where there's a noon placed in that unexpected position at the front of the verb. So those are some relatively unusual dynamics in the middle position. What about the third position if there's a weak radical? Well, for three gutturals, which in this case is going to be, for the sake of our discussion, 3 ayin or 3 chet, there are slight vowel changes, but not really anything that demands our attention compared to 3 aleph or 3 hey. That is because in biblical Aramaic, these are the same verb class. And historically, this was 3 yod or 3 vav. And so 3 yod and 3 vav coalesce into a single verb class that is now 3 aleph and 3 hey. So just like biblical Hebrew 3 hey verbs, that final radical can delete. But let's see these other dynamics. This is the chet yod hey verb. Now when I say become vav in my list here of possibilities, it happens that this is taking place when there's a suffix that has a vav there already. So it's debatable whether it's deleting outright or becoming that vav, but because the reference grammars talk about this being a a united class, both 3 yod and 3 vav. That's why I have become vav. Okay, next, there's the last special expectation, number 4, appear as alternate spellings. What am I talking about? That's where 3 hey becomes, it looks like 3 aleph, and 3 aleph becomes 3 hey. This is what I mean. This is hey vav hey, that verb, and it's pa'algi, perfect third masculine singular form. In this particular case, the hey has switched out with an aleph. And the reverse is true. This is kof resh aleph, where a hey has come into this pa'algi, imperfect third masculine singular form. So just as we have seen in several different grammatical situations to this point, hey and aleph interchange, in this case when they are the final radical in a root. Well, that's been a really quick review of the various kinds of weak verb in Biblical Aramaic. But I hope, in summary, what we see here is there are a few new things to learn, other than the expectations we've built up from Biblical Hebrew. But once we've learned them, we can do diagnostic reading. We can parse the verb forms or participles or infinitives. We can parse these forms and we can carry out our interpretation and not get sidetracked by trying to exhaustively predict the vowels that are going to show up in any particular place, or get thrown off when there's a deleted consonant from a verbal root. Weak verbs are in the majority, so we need to be able to deal with these various kinds of weak verb classes. And we can. So when we do our Biblical Aramaic reading, we'll see lots of weak verbs, and I promise you, they're not scary, and they follow these patterns.